Today about the rise of Technosocialism, my new book, and how the coronavirus crisis talks to us about some of the things we're going to have to deal with in the future, and some of the effects of the coronavirus as they take place as we come out of this crisis are going to be felt for long into human history. In fact, I think much of the world will talk about pre-COVID-19 and post-COVID-19 in terms of ways of talking about sociological, economical, and political changes as a result of what's happened with the coronavirus. When we look at the United States, I'm sitting here in New York at with a shelter-at-home or stay-at-home order issued by New York's Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio. And even though there's a little bit of traffic on the FDR today, it's certainly much, much less than what I would experience during normal business or work days or any day in New York City. Part of that is obviously because of social distancing requirements and laws or orders such as the stay-at-home order, but some of that is the fact that a large number of people have been taken out of the economy from employment jobs that aren't considered essential to the economy at this time. While some employers like Walmart and Amazon and others are attempting to hire 150,000 people each, we see 22 million people unemployed in just the couple of months that the coronavirus crisis has been active in the United States. In fact, it just took 21 days for the US economy, the world's largest economy, to be brought to its knees by the coronavirus. January 20th was when the first coronavirus case was officially recorded in the United States. We suspect that the coronavirus had been in the United States since before that, but we weren't testing people until at least January 20th at the time. In fact, the US didn't even have a coronavirus test until around middle of January. February 11th was the date that we saw the steepest bear market in history, affecting the Dow Jones and the Nasdaq, the US stock exchange. That's when the steepest bear market in history started, just on February 11th. That's just 21 days after the first victim of coronavirus in the United States was officially recorded. Now, the market wiped out more than a third of its value in just the period of less than a month. This all from a virus that measures 0.125 microns or 125 nanometers in diameter. That's 400 times smaller than the width of a human hair. I know I don't have many human hairs. And put the United States and other countries on a virtual war footing with this virus. Now, it could be argued that COVID-19 wasn't in fact a failure in medical capabilities, but it was a failure of the economy, how capitalism works, and how governance and globalism played out in the first early days of the coronavirus. We could have had enough ventilators, we could have had enough antivirals and other medicines stockpiled to react to coronavirus, but we didn't, because in most countries, having additional capacity of ICU beds and ventilators and personal protective equipment, PPE as it's being called today, and masks, is not an efficient market mechanism. And so the market doesn't keep huge stockpiles of these items in case of a pandemic when pandemics are so rare. That you could see as a failure of the market. We could have had all these supplies. We could have kept our medical staff safer. We could have responded better to the coronavirus than we did. In the United States, in 2005, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, along with the CDC and the George W. Bush administration, produced an influenza pandemic response plan that was updated by the Obama administration. And then subsequently by the Trump administration. Part of the learnings in the pandemic response plan were used by the WHO in planning the global response for a potential pandemic. And yet we didn't follow those guidelines. We didn't follow that plan when the COVID hit the fan. Bill Gates famously spoke about a potential pandemic at TED in 2015. In fact, his speech was so uncanny in terms of the potential risks that when COVID-19 hit, people thought his predictions were so close to reality that conspiracy theorists suggested he'd created the virus to make money off maybe creating a vaccine or trying to depopulate the planet. This, of course, is highly unlikely, but nevertheless, the fact that people like Bill Gates predicted this was pretty interesting. COVID-19, though, is just one of many emerging threats to our socio-political and economic systems today. We've seen that capitalism only was able to, or our current economic system, was only able to absorb the shock of the coronavirus crisis for a very short period of time before that system collapsed. Now, even if we return to some sort of normalcy after the coronavirus crisis, we are going to have to do things very differently. And this requires us thinking about redesigning systems like our healthcare systems and our economy to be able to absorb shocks like this better in the future. There are other threats that are coming, and these threats, like coronavirus, likely would have had very similar effects on our socio-economic systems. Two very clear emerging issues are climate change and techno-unemployment based from high levels of automation or artificial intelligence. Thanks to coronavirus, we might finally be ready to tackle some of these big issues, these big questions facing our species, and come out of the other side of this with a system that works better for all of humankind and not just a limited set of the wealthy elite who have the resources to survive economic conditions as they are today. An interesting side effect of coronavirus, incidentally, is that air pollution has dropped significantly, dropping by as much as 50% in some cities during the coronavirus lockdown. We can see this looking at satellite, looking at levels of pollutants in the air. Paris has seen nitrogen dioxide drop by 54%. Madrid, Milan, and Rome saw a drop of nearly 50%, according to scientists from the Royal Netherlands Meteorological Institution. There's other elements of change as well. People in India, in the state of Punjab, are reacting with awe at the sight of the Himalayan mountains. They're visible more than 100 miles away due to the first time in 30 years as a result of reduction in climate change. We see endangered sea turtles hatching on Brazil's deserted beaches as the coronavirus has kept crowds away that usually scare the turtles in respect to their activity. More than this, we see obviously pollution decreasing. We see some incredible changes in cities in respect to volume of people walking around. In Venice, in Italy, the water in the canals is so clear today that fish can be seen for the first time in decades. This change has been created by a dramatic shift in human activity on the planet. Lockdowns that have grounded flights, factories that have shut down, and obviously, clearly, reductions in transportation generally, with people driving less and so forth. Now, while climate change discussions have been delayed as a result of the coronavirus, now that we see the clear effects of human activity on the planet, with the absence of human activity producing these incredible rapid changes in our ecosystem, some believe that this might cause us to pause and listen to what the environment is telling us during the midst of the coronavirus. But in terms of the core changes that we need to make around coronavirus, I think when we start with this, we have to start thinking about, in the future, as we face challenges like coronavirus again, are we going to just sort of leave it to the free market to sort out, or are we going to have a better plan in place? One of the things that coronavirus has exposed is chinks in the armor of the global supply chain, with China being so central to supply chain around the world these days. The fact that it hit China first and those factories were shut down resulted obviously in dramatically lower production in factories in China and goods being shipped out of China. The issues around getting access to personal protective equipment, PPE and masks and so forth, and ventilators out of manufacturing sites in China is also clear during this period. Food production. We have farmers in the United States having food rotting in their fields because the distribution of that food is not possible during the coronavirus. These are systemic failures brought on by the coronavirus. And while many argue we need to get back to work, we also need to note where these failures could be mitigated in the future. So it's clear that some localization of supply chain for critical or essential elements to the economy, particularly those that we faced in the coronavirus crisis, those are going to have to be mitigated. We're going to see some of that localized. But at the same time, one of the clear failures globally in the response to COVID-19 was the failure of the global mechanisms for cooperation cross-border. Everyone tended to deal with this on their own. While there were guidelines and people were watching what was happening in the first countries that were exposed to COVID-19, when it came to actually implementing those changes nation by nation, it was really up to the local leadership, and we saw some doing that very well and some doing that very poorly. And so even though we had a global plan for the pandemic, as evidenced by WHO's preparation, and we had individuals like Bill Gates who'd been talking about this for a number of years, with over 20 years of planning, we still failed to act with a coherent plan on a global basis. So transparency, increased information sharing, increased cooperation are also clearly things that are going to be demanded of politicians and governments around the world as we move forward post-COVID-19. Now, how we get back to work is currently the big question. But the biggest question of all is, what should we do to ensure that if something like the coronavirus happens again, that we are not exposed to the same risks through lack of action? And I think there'll be a lot of pressure on the system to do that. When I started writing The Rise of Technosocialism, one of the clear strategies for mitigation of problems associated with either climate change or techno-unemployment was how we keep people fed and how we keep people in good health, housed, and how we make sure they have enough to live off in terms of finances. The presidential candidate in the United States, who has since stepped aside, but Andrew Yang, who was one of the Democrat candidates in the running, he proposed what they called a freedom dividend, which was another word, a carefully crafted designation for universal basic income. Now, at the time, universal basic income was almost completely panned by most economists as impractical, and despite the potential risks around the impact of climate change and the impact of techno-based unemployment, it wasn't seriously under consideration. We were waiting for a crisis to show us that something like universal basic income was required. Now, under the coronavirus, of course, we've had some support payments going out to both small businesses and citizens, and bailing out larger industries as well, here in the US and elsewhere around the globe. In fact, Spain has implemented universal basic income not just for the period of the coronavirus COVID-19 crisis, but this is now going to be put in place for the foreseeable future. So this is a big shift. Prior to coronavirus, I was attempting to write a very detailed business case to support how universal basic income could happen. And here we are, just months after Andrew Yang stepped aside from his bid for the presidency. And we're now seeing this being implemented in some form. This is a dramatic shift. Now, will it stick? Well, that's a bigger question. In markets like Australia, where I'm from, here in the US and the UK, the criticism of policies like UBI are considered socialist policies. And yet, as a nation, as a species around the globe, we are learning that we need to stick together. We need social coherence. We need a plan to mitigate these risks. The system is so fragile that within a couple of weeks of the shelter-in-place or stay-at-home orders, we have more than 20 million people unemployed. We have tens of thousands of people lining up at food banks in the United States just to get enough food to survive. This is not a robust system that can cope with these types of spikes or risks that we see like the coronavirus. We must have a better plan. Now, we could just say, look, the coronavirus was a very rare event. It's not likely to happen again. And so let's just go back to the way we were. But if we do that, we risk that we will repeat this cycle over and over again as crises like the COVID-19 coronavirus impact the planet. And there is strong evidence to suggest that sea rise and temperature changes as a result of climate change could easily produce a similar effect to what we're seeing with coronavirus, but on a much more extended period. And right in the middle of these two events, between coronavirus and the impact of climate change, we have the potential impact of automation, robotics, and artificial intelligence impacting vast swathes of the employed in modern economies and developing economies alike. So it's highly likely over the next 50 years that the coronavirus will not be a unique black swan event, that we will have similar events that challenge the status quo in terms of economics. There are real economic changes coming as well, and I'll get into that in the book in terms of how we think about supply and demand and global supply chain and things like that. But to be clear, once we have high levels of automation, and that's behind a large portion of our production or the ability to supply goods and services into the economy, we're no longer seeing demand from the market linked directly to labor participation. because it's just bits and bytes. It's AIs and automated machinery that can respond to that demand. It doesn't necessarily result in increased labor participation. So there are fundamental economic changes that need to be thought through as a result of COVID-19. It's not just the fact that we've had this crisis either. We are now within reach of providing a range of services that rid us of some of the most severe or significant problems humanity has faced in our entire existence. We have the ability to remove homelessness as a social issue. The cost of now producing 3D printed homes and using technology like this enables us, or should enable us, to provide housing for every person on the planet, theoretically. Healthcare. The US system has exposed the risks of not having everyone covered with basic health care. People refusing to go to hospitals because they're fearful of the hospital bill they might receive as a result of coronavirus treatment, staying at home and infecting their family or infecting others in their community. This is something that, on the basis of the technologies we're developing now, should be within reach of humanity to have basic healthcare provided for the largest nations on the planet, certainly, and the most prosperous nations, certainly, but extending that over time to the entire planet. Education is being done remotely, and we theoretically could provide ubiquitously very good quality education to many more students than we can today, based on restrictions around classroom size and so forth. We should be able to provide better education services through this technology lab. We're learning how to do that out of the coronavirus crisis. And of course, financial services will have to change. The role money plays in the economy is going to have to change to some extent. Dependency on a salary just to get enough food to eat in a crisis like coronavirus is no longer a sufficient measure. We must have other mechanisms for the broader social good. Now, of course, the question is, who's going to pay for all of this? Well, that's one question. The other question is, do we have the technical capacity to provide these types of services to everyone on the planet? The planet certainly has the capacity to produce enough food, shelter, and basic services for every human on the planet, if we wish it. But we would have to have a different set of values. The problem with pure capitalism is that when you get to big problems like solving the issues around coronavirus, when you get to big problems like that of techno-based unemployment, homelessness, pollution, and our lack of response to climate change, these types of issues, capitalism really doesn't have incentives to fix these big issues. We are seeing incentives right now, but if you think about what has driven our response and taking care of people, it's more about politics and the demands that, reasonable demands, that are expected of governments in a time of crisis to be able to look after citizens. So you have sort of competing principles here. We are one species, and while national borders divide us, coronavirus has hit us equally, regardless of which nation we're in, what race, color of our skin we are, how wealthy or how poor we are. It's been indiscriminate. And as a species, we should have the potential, or we do have the potential, to attack this on a much better level system-wide. When we look at economics, and we look at making sure people are looked after, again, we have the capacity to do that, but the the responses by governments as a result of coronavirus haven't been driven by the free market. They've been driven by more social concerns about ensuring that minimal impact is made, or minimizing the impact that's made on the population at large. So we can do it if we want to. We have, during the coronavirus, responded as a species. We've responded for the needs of every human affected by this. And this is how, as a species, I think we have to come out of the coronavirus crisis. We have to think about, how do we make sure everyone is looked after? How do we mitigate these risks from happening again? And what systemic changes do we need to make to ensure that long into the future, humanity can ride out these issues with minimal impact? No one should frankly have to starve or die as a result of the economic impacts of coronavirus. And in the future, hopefully, we'll have the technology such that no one will have to die because of the effects of the virus either. I think coming out of the coronavirus, it's going to be time for humanity to learn some deep lessons, some big game-changing lessons that change the future of humanity well into the future, far into the future, and we'll look back at this as a catalyst for positive change. I hope you enjoyed my rambling thoughts today, but I definitely will be able to share with you guys soon more on this from my new book, The Rise of Technosocialism, which I'm producing with Dr. Richard Petty out of Hong Kong. I thank you for your time today.